Hi, I'm Margaret with Sacramento Art Classes, and I'm making this video today at the request of some of my students who were brand new, never tried it before, watercolor painters. And so I thought this would be a great video for anybody who's just starting watercolor. Maybe you've never painted yet, or you're just getting started. There's a lot of tips in here about brushes and paints and paper and how to set up your palette. So it's great to watch before you start that, and if you like it, share it with a friend. Here we go. One of the most important things to consider when you start watercolor painting is that paper really does matter. It really makes a difference what kind of surface you are painting on. Sometimes if you use the less expensive papers or pads of paper out there, or even a lighter weight paper, it really makes a difference on how much workability you have with your paints and how many changes and how many layers you can add in your paintings. I always suggest that people purchase the very best quality products that they can afford for the best results. So one of the things that I like to paint on, just to keep it a little bit less expensive, is a pad. And this is watercolor paper made by Hansa in a spiral bound pad. You can find this at pretty much any art store. But the most important part about this is the weight. This is 140-pound paper. It is cold pressed, which means it has a little bit of a texture to it, a little bit of a tooth. And you can see on the sample here how you can kind of see the not the grain, but the markings in the paper. So 140-pound cold pressed is nice. There's three types: cold, which is your mid-range in texture; rough, which is a very rough texture, and that's good for something like snowy paintings or sand or rough edges like you might find on the bark of a tree. And then they also make smooth, which is a very smooth, almost like a semi-gloss to the paper, but it's really good for very fine detail. I like the middle of the road here with cold pressed. So this is a painting that was just started out just playing with some things. By the way, this is what will happen if you lay saran wrap over the top of wet paint and leave it on to dry. You'll get a texture like this. So anyway, this is a nice way to start if you are trying to be on a budget. The next step up would be something like Arches paper, or Fabriano is a nice one. There's tons and tons of different really nice papers, but Arches or Arche is cold pressed 100% cotton paper. It's also 140 pound, and this is called a block. And what this is a block of 20 sheets of paper. You can maybe see right there, it says 20. And they are sealed on all, the paper is sealed all the way around the edge with like a gluey kind of stuff, so that actually you're only able to access one page at a time, the very top page. This is a protective piece that you take off, but here we have a painting that had been started already, and you can see that all these sheets of paper are glued together on the edges except for right here. And you want to paint on this actual block because the paper is held by this glue, so it will be flat and straight and doesn't buckle very much at all your whole time that you're painting. Where something like this one, you can maybe see there's a little curve to the paper. If I tip it sideways, and it buckles. So painting on a pad, that's the kind of downfall, is that it will buckle, and you probably want to tape it, maybe tear it out of the book and tape it onto something. So the block alleviates that problem, and when you're ready to, your painting is all done and all dry, you'd use something like a palette knife or a butter knife, and you can slip this in between the top layer of paper and all of the others. I'm not going to do it now because I don't want to detach it, but you just slip this through and then kind of basically slide your knife around the edge and cut this off and remove the top layer of paper. So that's a block. These are more expensive. If you want to try using good paper like Arche, you can buy it in sheets. The full sheet of paper is 22 by 30 inches, and maybe it's 33, I can't remember. It's really big, and normally what we do is we fold it up and cut it into at least fourths to paint with. But I haven't been doing that lately. Mostly I've been painting on blocks. Another block that I like is this one. This is my new favorite. It's a Hansa brand. It's 100% cotton. It's 140-pound cold pressed. And when I paint in here, this palette, this particular brand, the paper stays the flattest and the least amount of buckling of any of the blocks that I've used. So I really like this one, and the paper has a good texture. You can see that I painted off or taped off the edges with, I used blue painter's tape, but you can use masking tape. And that's because I want my finished painting size to be about an 8 by 10. This is a 9 by 12 block, which is my favorite size these days, but I usually tape down so that my finished piece is about 8 by 10. You can totally paint all the way out the edge if you want to, but if you are going to matte this, you want to leave a little bit, you want to realize that you're going to lose a little bit of the painting underneath the edge of the mat, so you may want to not put anything really important around the edge. Okay, one last thing on paper is stretching paper. There is another video which I will link to this. It's not made by me, but it was made by somebody else, and it shows you how to stretch paper. This way here is kind of the quick way, and it isn't the best way, but in a pinch I'll do this. Let's say maybe I have a pad, or I want to take the top layer off one of my blocks and paint on one piece. Why would I do that? Maybe because if I need to trace something onto here, you can't trace on a block because you can't see through all the layers. So you may occasionally have to remove one piece of paper, and in that case, the way to stretch it is you get the paper completely wet in your sink, both sides. Run it under water, let it get completely wet, and then I use a piece of plexiglass. So I have purchased this plexi, but a lot of people use boards. I use boards too, or you can use really heavy, kind of a cardboard called gator board, and you want to lay that wet piece of paper flat on whatever your board is, and then while it's wet you want to tape it down to the board, and as it dries it will dry flat and tight like a drum, as long as it's taped down. Now I have to say that I have less success doing this on this plexiglass, but I like the plexi anyway because it's nice and portable. If you use a board, the best way to do it would be to actually staple your paper, your wet paper, onto the board, and then if you want to tape your edges, then tape it. But that's another video, and I'll link that below. Okay, so that's all I have to say about paper for now. Let's go on to something else. Okay, let's next talk about brushes. I mentioned before that try your best to buy the best products that you can afford, but not everybody can afford really expensive things, and if you're just beginning, you don't want to invest that much. So you can get really decent brushes for not a lot of money. I like to keep my brushes on a tray, so I have this fun tray. It says, "Life is tricky, babe, stay in your magic." So I just keep my brushes there. You don't have to do that, I just like to. You're going to want to have maybe a cloth or a towel of some sort, even a paper towel, because a lot of times during painting you are blotting your brush on here, like all the time. So you need something absorbent where you can kind of get excess water off your brush. So we'll start with this one. This is a 1-inch flat. This is a synthetic brush, and it's very inexpensive. You can even buy a set of these in somewhere like Michael's or pretty much any art store. This is good for laying on large washes, covering a lot of area of your painting fast, like a background or a sky. And it also gives you a very smooth finish. So this is a nice one to have, and they come in all different sizes. This is a 1-inch. I have a 1.5-inch that I use. I also have this 1/2-inch. It's a different brand that I use. So I would say a 1/2-inch and a 1-inch are good. If you want to invest in a third one, maybe get yourself a 1.5. This top brush here is interesting because it has this chisel tip on the end of the handle. Can you see that? Maybe it's better against something dark. And this allows me to, this is a tool, so I can use this for gouging or scraping or drawing lines on my paper, so that's kind of a nice thing to have. You can always use the back side of your brush for a tool like that too if you want to maybe scrape. But be careful, because when you have a painted brush, like this is white painted, and I don't have one in front of me, but here's one. This one is painted red, but it has a silver tip. If you scrape with this, you might actually be scraping some of that brush's paint onto your paper. So if you want to use this as a tool, I would say scrape it ahead of time on something unimportant, or maybe even a little nail file or a little bit of sandpaper will help you out. Okay, so those are those two brushes, the two flats. And then you're going to want to have some round brushes. There are a variety of different sizes. I like to have something large, and I usually have something even larger than this. This is a number 12 round, and it's about as big as maybe my pinky for comparison. Sorry, my lighting is kind of extra bright here. But a number 12 round is nice because it has a good belly to the brush that holds a lot of paint and water so that you can go a long distance with one brush load full of paint, and it comes to a really precise point. So that's a 12, and I also use a number 8 a lot. This can give me a pretty decent amount of fine detail. But if I need even more detail, I'll use something really small like this 0, or sometimes they call it a quill. So those are good to have. The only other brush that you may want to have down the road is something with a stiffer bristle that is maybe a hog hair bristle, just for scrubbing and lifting. So with this set of brushes here, you can go a long way to do everything. You do not need to buy natural hair because it's more expensive. Sable hair is the most expensive, and I probably have 1 or 2 of those, and I've had them for over 20 years, so they last, but they're expensive. All of these are synthetic, and they do a great job, and I really enjoy them. So do not worry about spending a ton on a natural hair brush, but get a good quality brush. I'm using Escodas, which are high-end. You may not need that. And then this is a Fibonacci, also a high-end, but these guys are cheap. So a nice variety is cool. Okay, next are some other little tools that you may want to have. You don't have to have, but you may want to. And the most important of these optional tools is this little mister, this little spray bottle. This is really nice to have to pre-wet your paper, or to keep your paints wet, or prime your paints ahead of time. Just get them wet with this. You can buy this real cheap at the dollar store or in the travel section of your CVS or whatever your pharmacy store is. Something like this is great, and they come in different sizes. You can buy them at art stores. They look like this, but they cost more, so know that. You may like to have an eyedropper of some sort, and you can get a cheap one like this at a craft store, or you can just save an old eyedropper from medicine that you've tossed, and you just keep your eyedropper. It's nice to have that. I don't have in front of me a toothbrush, but that might be something nice to have too, an old toothbrush. Something to scrape with, like a bamboo skewer that you use for shish kebabs or food, or if you have a golf tee like I do. This is a wooden one, but you could certainly have plastic. So something like that to scrape with. Speaking of scrapers, if you have gift cards from Starbucks or wherever that are all used up, save those gift cards because they make really nice scrapers, and you can cut them into thin strips too. So golf tee. And then salt of some sort. I like sea salt because it's a little bit thicker or heavier, coarser, I guess it is, than table salt. But table salt, sea salt, kosher salt, rock salt, Epsom salt, this makes nice textures, and we won't get into that in this video so much, but it's nice to have some salt. And the last 2 things are masking fluid. Masking fluid comes in different ways. This is a bottle, and you would need use an old brush, an old beat up brush, or that bamboo skewer that I talked about to apply this. You don't want to use a good brush because this is like liquid latex, and it's kind of got a rubber cementy feel when it dries, and it will ruin your brushes. But this is used to cover up areas that you want to keep pure white. You can remove it later towards the end of your painting, and then you have your white highlights. You can remove it with your finger just by rubbing, or you can buy this, which is a piece of rubber that is kind of like an eraser. It gets a little dirty as you use it, but this will remove your masking fluid. This one is slightly tinted yellow, and make sure when you get this that you get removable, because there actually is non-removable. I don't know why, but there is. So make sure you get removable masking fluid. Masking fluid also comes in the form of a pen, which has its own it's like a precise tip, and it's the kind that you depress the tip to get the flow of the masking fluid going, and then you can do really precise things with this, like maybe middles of flowers or teeny tiny details that you want to keep white. So this brand is Pebeo or PBO brand. There's several brands, but these are nice to have too. And one last thing that I just saw as I was talking, you might like to have a sponge. You don't have to have a sea sponge like I do. You could use a kitchen sponge, but maybe tear it up so it is irregular and not just a square blocky sponge. Let it be like a chunky irregular thing. You can make marks with this, and you can wet a whole area with water with this, so very handy, as are Kleenex or paper towels. definitely handy to have those. Okay, so that's a lot there. Let's pause for a second before we go on to the next section. Okay, the next thing that we're going to talk about is palettes, and also you might notice that I changed my lighting a little bit. It was just a little too reflective and too bright, so if you notice that change, that's what happened. Okay, there are so many different types of palettes, everything from these teeny tiny little palettes. This isn't even really so much of a palette as a case of paint. This is a beautiful company called Wildthorn that I bought one of their little 6-packs of paints. This is called a half pan. This size is a half pan, and actually this one has a magnet on the back, so it magnetizes into this little tin case. These are really good to keep in your pocket if you're just going out for fun somewhere to sketch outside and you have some paints like this. It's a nice thing to have, and a couple of brushes and a bottle of water or a cup of water, and you're good to go. By the way, since we're talking about cups of water, this is a travel cup, and it actually pops out like this. So you can bring a bottle of water, or if you're at the ocean, or not the ocean so much because it's salt water, but a creek or a river or lake, you can fill this up with water, and then when you're ready to go, you just pack it up small. So that's a nice thing to have if you're going to be traveling. So back to palettes. We had this tiny one. This is one of my favorite palettes. It has a little hook for your finger on the back in case you want to hold it. I usually leave mine flat, but it opens up and you have these nice paint wells. You can see this is well used, but each side has these large areas and smaller areas over here for paint mixing. These are called full pans. So you can see these two small guys here. That was the half pans, just like I showed you in this tiny one. And these are full pans. It's just size, you know, maybe you have a color that you use more of and you want to have a full pan. The nice thing about this palette is that the palette itself comes empty, and then you can buy these little pans and fill them with whatever color you want. So this was custom, my favorite customs that I put in here from all, this happens to be a Daniel Smith brands of paint, but you could mix and match, and you can use all kinds of different brands of paints. We'll talk about paint brands in a few minutes. So this is a nice one, and then it folds up like this and closes. They make different sizes of those, and this one here is, if you are a new painter, you might actually love something like this because it's really affordable. This is a Paul Rubens set. It's a 24 pan, full pan set of watercolors, and I did a demo just on this, which I will link below in case you want to see it, but it comes with swatching paper inside with all the colors already listed here, so you can test out your own paint. It has this card with the palette, and it's see-through, so you can hold it up against a color if you're trying to color match. You can see your color you're trying to match through this. And then it has 24 different colors of paint. I am not a person who really feels like having white is essential. I barely ever use it because in watercolors the white comes from us saving the white of the paper. But every once in a while you need a little bit of white. So anyway, they include it, and they also include black in this set. I don't use very much black. I prefer to mix my own really dark colors that seem like black. So I don't use a lot of black and white. If I need white, sometimes I keep myself a little tube of this. It's called Chinese white, or you could use white gouache, which is an opaque paint, in case you need to like fix a little something or add a little sparkle or add a little touch of white. Sometimes I use this tube of white that I just keep. So anyway, this is Paul Rubens' set. It's a really nice set. But my main go-to when I'm painting in the studio is a large palette like this one. This is called, can I read it? Robert, it's got like a raised texture. Robert E. Wood palette. You don't need this brand. There's plenty of different brands, but it's nice because it's really large and it has a lid. It's not a lid that seals in any liquid, so you don't want to tip it because it will still spill. And then there are 4 mixing wells on the top, which I don't use that often, but once in a while you need something, so you can use that. And then when you take the lid off, These are all the colors, and I prefer to use colors from a tube over colors that come in a pan like these. These are great for travel, and I sometimes just have fun with them because I actually collect a lot of different brands of these palettes. But when I'm just painting in studio, I like this for two reasons. Number one is because I can fit 24 colors in there, and this is a lot of paint. These are larger than the full pans that I showed you in these other palettes. And then if you're like me and you need even more colors, you can save the lids from some of your old bottles of vitamins or whatever you have, and then glue those in, and then you have more wells to put paints in. I like this set because this is my 1-inch brush, and my 1-inch brush easily fits into these wells, so I can get a whole lot of paint on. I have a large mixing area in the middle for paint mixing. And then a trick that I learned at the beginning of my painting career, let's see if I can make this happen, is on the side, I put tape, like masking tape or whatever kind of tape, with the names of my colors right there. And a lot of times in little palettes, there's no way for you to know your color unless you have your chart with you. So I write down all of the names of all of the colors, and I put the tape along the edge so that I know that this right here is Prussian Blue and this right here is Ultramarine Blue. When you're just beginning, you might need to know your color names, but after a while you just kind of memorize the colors and get to know your set. So, so that is my palette, and let's pause there for a second while I go get some other paints to show you. Okay, I'm back. I was mentioning to you earlier that I like to use paints that come in tubes, and so I buy a variety of different brands. I buy Daniel Smith, Winsor Newton, Holbein. I can't think of any others right now, but lots of different brands, and I buy them in the tubes. So this is your standard size right here. This one is 15 milliliters, and this one is a smaller size, so you have two options. If you get this smaller size, you probably will squeeze this entire amount into one of your wells. So what I want to do is talk to you about setting up your palette for the first time. It's really nice to get a palette that has a lid on it, and maybe 3 days or so before you paint or before you go to your first painting class, you want to put your paint colors into the well, squeeze them into the tubes, and put them in there and let them dry up. So these paints that are in here, if you can see, they're completely dry. I'm touching them and they've probably been in here for years, and then I just come along with my spray mister and I mist them ahead of time before I'm ready to use them. So when you're setting up your palette for the first time, you want to squeeze all these in and set it aside to dry. Later, when you start using it, I like to leave the lid off for a while so they kind of dry out a little bit after I'm done with my painting session. But I keep all my extra paints here in a little container, and so I can go back in and refill my wells as necessary. When you're first starting out, if you don't want to have a large palette like this, you can do something like this one. These are super cheap. You can put the paints in the wells around the outside there, and then you have a small mixing area in the center, or you could buy a couple if you need more mixing areas. So this is an option. And one last thing on paint colors. To go with your tools, I forgot to mention earlier, you may want to have either a piece of wax, like a wax birthday candle that's white, or just a white crayon, because a lot of times we use this, or we use that masking fluid that I mentioned to keep an area pure and white. And so if you do this ahead of time, then you have an area that repels the paint and stays white. You cannot remove this because it's wax, so you're stuck with it. Make sure that's what you want to do, but I like to have one of these handy just in case I need to do something like that. Okay, so let's take a break for a minute, and then we'll come back and talk about how to apply some paints. Okay, and for the last section of this video here, we're going to talk about how to apply paint. I mean, it seems kind of basic, but really there are some tips and tricks. You want to make sure that you have a towel or something nearby to blot your brush on. You want to have a container of water. I use this really old jug of soap, laundry soap, and I've cut the top off. I like it because it has ridges on the bottom there, if you can see, and it kind of helps me clean my brush. But this has been well used and well loved, and it was basically free. But you could just use a cup or a pot or some type of water container. So brush, paper, water, and your paint. A few things about colors. We'll just go really quickly through this because this is really a whole other video. A lot of what we do in watercolor painting is a technique called wet into wet. So let me zoom in on the paper here for you. Wet into wet means that you are pre-wetting the paper with just clear water. Oops, sorry, we need a little bit of focus there. You're just pre-wetting with clear water, and then you're going to add paint into that water. That is called wet into wet. So what we do is, I'm using that number 12 round. I'm just going to wet a section. You can't even see it because it's just clear water, but I've pre-wet this area, and then when I get paint from my palette, which is right next door here, but my camera's not going to let you see that at the same time. When I pick up some of this beautiful purple-y pink and I just touch my brush down into that area where I pre-wet, you can see that the paint travels only into that watery area. It's called a water dam. So that means that the paint I'm applying will not go past that wet area. So here I can tap in a little bit more. I'm just touching my brush on, and it'll travel all over into that wet area. I can even tip my paper and let gravity kind of pull it around, and unless I bang my paper on the desk here, it's not going to escape that area. You can see that some areas are less painty and some are more, and that's just because I touched more paint on up there. If I wanted more paint here, I would just continue to add more. And then as long as this area is wet or damp, the paint will keep moving and traveling. And watercolor paint, as it dries lighter. So you will not have that strong of a paint color once it's dry. It'll be a little lighter. So if we did another area of wet into wet, this is kind of a one color, and it's sort of a fade from darker to lighter. But you can actually do a 2-color fade, or 3 or 4, whatever you want. So let me give you a few different colors here. This is a nice blue called Peacock Blue, and I'm going to put that up here at the top of that wet area, and then down towards the bottom here I'm going to pick up some yellow, a very nice light yellow called Hansa Yellow Lights, kind of like a daffodil color, and I'm putting that down here at the bottom. Now remember, it's wet in the middle, and as the paint travels, because whenever it's on a wet patch it will continue to travel, or I can tip this, these two paints are going to meet in the middle, and they're going to blend and form their own new color. So yellow and blue make green, and we'll get a green band across the middle there before this dries completely. So this is a way to blend two colors. I like to let the colors blend on their own rather than using my brush to manipulate it, because a lot of times if I were to come back in here, let's actually do a new one so that you can see it a different way. Let's take this yellow again. This time I'm just going to go on dry paper. So that's just wet on dry, or wet into dry. So you can see there is my yellow, and let's take that same blue, and if I were messing around with it and mixing it myself here on the paper and kind of manipulating things and forcing it to blend by using my brush, you get, I guess you could say, a more controlled look. But it is not spontaneous, and it doesn't allow us to see that neat transparency that you get by having different colors coming together. And in fact, if I tip it and let gravity pull it down, eventually that whole square will become a beautiful green. But you have the danger of overworking things and making things look muddy in a painting if you do too much manipulating with your brush. So for example, if I decided I wanted to come in and have something else happen down here, I don't know what, let's get a different green, and maybe I have some green grass or something, and I start doing this, and then maybe I have another color that I'm adding to darken it up. Eventually you get like this muddy, overworked area. So in this very, very short demo of paint on your paper, I just want you to realize, try not to manipulate things with your brush too much. Let it happen on its own. Okay, so we did a little bit of color mixing, we did a little bit of wet into wet, and then that was these two, and then wet on dry paper. Something else happens if you have a paint that is starting to dry, and then you come in maybe you accidentally drip some water on it like that, or maybe you come in with another color to layer over it. You get what's called a bloom, and you can see it starting to form here. That new wet watery paint that I introduced is pushing the paint that was already on the paper out of its way. It's like a cauliflower. Sometimes they call it a runback, they call it a bloom, they call it a cauliflower. And it can be really cool and look interesting and get great effects like clouds in a sky or sparkles. But it could also be undesirable if you're trying to have a beautiful, smooth blue sky or whatever color you're working with, and you get a cauliflower like that. So it's a tool. You might want it, but you might want to avoid it. You just need to know that it exists. And the last thing that we'll talk about, and then we're done with this video, is you can use that table salt. Remember that I talked to you about earlier? Actually, mine was sea salt. You can use that to create really fun and interesting effects in your paint, like a sparkly sky or maybe a field with some flowers in it. And so what I did was I laid down just clear water, and here comes some nice green. This green, by the way, is a Holbein color. It's called bamboo green. This salt effect that I'm going to show you works best with darker colors because there is more of a contrast or a change in the value of light to dark. When you're using a darker paint, this thing with the salt works better. So I've sprinkled a little salt into my hand, and then I'm just going to take a pinch of it and sprinkle it onto my paper. And you can see probably already the little graininess that happens, and that is because anytime you put anything, a pebble, some sand, a piece of rice, salt, whatever, onto paint that's wet, that object will draw or pull the paint to itself. So what you're seeing is the paint is being pulled to each individual grain of grain of salt, and the paint gathers there. And what you do is you want to leave that on until it is completely dry, and when it's dry you brush away the salt and you have a little kind of sparkly effect. Sometimes salt even gives you like crystal effect, like frost on a window. So having that is a really fun thing that you can do. And let me go grab a piece of paper to show you some that's already done so you can see what effects you might get. Okay, thank you for your patience. This is a sampler that I made for teaching a watercolor class, and here is an excellent example of something that you might achieve by using salt. And I think that this was kosher salt, so it has a heavier, thicker grain, and you get an effect like that. Whereas right next to it, this is table salt, so we still have something interesting, but it's a little bit less sparkly. And here are a few more images of different salt. And it depends on the paper, it depends on, the type of salt, and it also depends on how wet or dry your paper is when you sprinkle. If you sprinkle it on when it's really, really wet, it melts the salt. If you sprinkle it on when the paper is not even shiny anymore, it's already dried to a damp stage, it won't do anything. So it's one of those things where it would be fun for you to practice and kind of try it out. Okay, that's all I have for you. Thanks so much for watching this video, and share it with a friend. Have a good day.